Jesse James is one of those names people think they already know. But most of what gets repeated is legend, not the full story. This video breaks down what actually happened, why he became famous in the first place, and how newspapers, politics, and public attention helped turn a real criminal into a long-lasting icon. We'll follow the key events, the people around him, and the choices that shaped his reputation, without the movie-style extras. Number 1. A border state childhood. Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, an area people later called Little Dixie because so many settlers had come from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia and brought Southern politics and slavery with them. That detail matters because Missouri wasn't a clean North versus South place. It was a border state where neighbors could be on opposite sides and where violence wasn't some far-off battlefield story. It was local. Jesse's father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister and a slave owner who also tried his hand at farming. He left for the California gold rush when Jesse was still a kid and died there, which meant Jesse grew up in a household led by his mother, Zerelda, on a working farm in a tense, divided region. Jesse's older brother, Frank James, born in 1843, was closer to adulthood when the Civil War arrived, and that put him on a path that would pull Jesse in too. It's also worth clearing up a common Wild West image early. Jesse James wasn't a desert cowboy drifting between saloons. His world was wooded creeks, small towns, and farms in Missouri, with the big pressure points being politics, loyalty, and revenge. Missouri sat at the edge of the expanding United States, but Jesse's story is really about a border region that felt like it was constantly being fought over, by armies, by militias, and later by lawmen and private detectives. Number 2. Guerrilla war made him. The Civil War in Missouri often didn't look like neat lines of soldiers facing each other. It turned into a nasty guerrilla conflict, especially along the Missouri-Kansas border. Frank joined pro-Confederate guerrillas, and Jesse, still a teenager, eventually followed into that violent underground world. Groups like Quantrill's Raiders, and later the fighters around William Bloody Bill Anderson, became infamous for ambushes, raids, and brutal payback. Kansas and Missouri towns lived with fear of surprise attacks, and it created a cycle where every killing justified the next one. Jesse's later criminal life makes more sense when you realize his training ground wasn't normal crime. It was irregular warfare, quick strikes, local intelligence, hiding with sympathetic families, and treating enemies as targets, not as people you negotiate with. He was wounded during the war years, and by the time the Confederacy collapsed, a lot of guerrillas didn't just go home and become peaceful farmers. They had enemies, they had reputations, and many felt they had no place in the new order. When people later tried to turn Jesse into a romantic outlaw, they often skipped over this part, but this is the part that explains his mindset. Loyalty to his own circle, deep hatred for certain Union-aligned figures, and a comfort with violence that most civilians didn't have. If you're looking for the origin story, it's right here, and it's darker and more political than the legend usually admits. Number 3. Reconstruction was the pressure cooker. After 1865, the United States didn't simply go back to normal, especially not in Missouri. Reconstruction politics, loyalty oaths, and local power struggles kept the tension high. Many former Confederates felt punished, watched, or shut out, while Union veterans and pro-Union officials tried to keep control. In that atmosphere, ex-guerrillas were hunted, arrested, or threatened, and the line between law and revenge often blurred. Jesse and Frank came out of a world where they had lived by the gun, and now they were in a world where the winning side had the badges, the courts, and the ability to label them as criminals forever. That doesn't excuse what came next, but it does explain why the transition into outlaw life wasn't a sudden personality change. It was more like a continuation of conflict by different means. Jesse's supporters later claimed he was resisting oppression, but when you look at what the gang actually did, it wasn't political organizing or protecting communities. It was robbery, and it was deadly. Still, the timing matters. The first big robberies linked to the James Circle happened right as the country was arguing over what the post-war South and border states should look like. That argument gave Jesse a ready-made audience, people who hated Reconstruction and wanted a symbol of defiance. He didn't create that mood, but he benefited from it, and he learned quickly how useful it could be to have public sympathy, even if you didn't deserve it.
Number 4.
The gang takes shape. The robbery that often gets called the first daylight bank robbery in peacetime happened in Liberty, Missouri in February 1866. Historians still debate exact participants, but that event became part of the Jesse James story almost immediately, and it set the template. Armed men moving fast, taking cash and valuables, then escaping before local lawmen could react. Over time, the crew most associated with Jesse and Frank became known as the James Younger Gang, especially with Cole Younger and his brothers Jim, Bob, and John, along with other rotating members. These weren't desperate amateurs. They planned routes, used fresh horses, relied on friendly contacts, and took advantage of the fact that law enforcement was local and fragmented. In that era, a sheriff's power didn't automatically reach across county lines, and state-to-state coordination was slow. A gang that could cross a border quickly could buy itself time. They robbed banks in small towns and hit trains, especially when rail travel and express companies were moving large sums. One important reality check: the Robin Hood idea doesn't hold up well. There's no solid evidence that Jesse regularly redistributed stolen money to poor families in some organized, meaningful way. The gang stole for themselves and their network. Sometimes they avoided taking from certain people, sometimes they didn't. But the idea of a consistent charity mission is mostly legend building, not a proven pattern. The real story is that they were building a criminal brand in a time when branding wasn't even called branding yet. Number 5. Trains, telegraphs, and a modernizing country. When people picture the Old West, they often imagine open plains, cattle drives, and frontier forts. Jesse James operated in a different but related world. The United States was modernizing fast, and railroads were the most visible symbol of that change. Rail lines connected distant towns, moved goods quickly, and made certain companies very powerful. For many rural communities, railroad corporations felt distant, rich, and unfair, especially when disputes over land, pricing, and political influence flared up. The James Gang understood that public resentment. They could rob a train and frame it as a hit against a powerful corporation rather than a crime against ordinary people. That messaging mattered because trains carried more than cargo. They carried the feeling that the country was being reorganized around big money. At the same time, trains also helped law enforcement. Rail travel let pursuers move faster, and the telegraph let news of robberies spread quickly. That push and pull is a big part of why Jesse James became famous. He was doing old-style violence and theft right as new technology was tightening the net. Some train robberies involved derailing a train to force a stop, then going after the express safe. Other times, the gang targeted specific cars and tried to keep the whole thing controlled and fast. Either way, these weren't harmless stunts. People were threatened at gunpoint, and in some robberies, people were killed.
The legend loves the drama of outlaws versus the Iron Horse, but the reality on the ground was fear, chaos, and victims who didn't sign up to be part of anyone's folklore. Number 6. Pinkertons and the PR machine. One reason Jesse James became more than a local criminal is that he ended up in a long public war with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Railroads and express companies hired Pinkertons because local sheriffs often couldn't track a mobile gang across multiple states. Alan Pinkerton's organization built files, used informants, and tried to apply more systematic pressure than a typical posse could manage. That effort escalated the conflict, and it also escalated Jesse's celebrity.
The most infamous moment came when Pinkerton agents targeted the James family farm in Missouri in January 1875. An incendiary device was thrown into the home, leading to a tragedy. Jesse's young half-brother Archie was killed, and Jesse's mother Zerelda was badly injured. News of that raid shocked many people, including people who disliked the James gang. It made the Pinkertons look ruthless and reckless, and it handed Jesse exactly what he needed: sympathy and outrage aimed at his pursuers. Around the same time, Jesse benefited from friendly journalism, especially through writer and editor John Newman Edwards, who published pieces that painted Jesse and Frank as former Confederate fighters being persecuted by corrupt authorities. This is where the legend really starts to harden. Jesse wasn't just robbing, he was being marketed. His letters and statements, some genuine, some possibly shaped by allies, fed the image of a man with a cause. The key point is that a famous outlaw is not only made by crimes, he's made by the story people tell afterward. And Jesse James had people willing to tell that story loud and often. Number 7. How lawmen actually hunted outlaws. It's easy to imagine the law in the Old West as a single tough sheriff riding out alone. The real system was messier. Most law enforcement power was local. County sheriffs, town marshals, and state militias with limited budgets and limited reach. If a robbery happened, a posse might form quickly, but fast horses and local knowledge often mattered more than badges. The James gang survived partly because they operated in areas where they had family connections and where some locals, for political or personal reasons, didn't rush to help the authorities. Silence can be as powerful as support. There are also practical limits. Descriptions traveled slowly. Photographs weren't always available or widely shared, and a man could change his beard, use a different name, and slip into a new town without instantly being recognized. Rewards helped, but rewards also brought unreliable tips, fake sightings, and opportunists. Over time, pressure increased. Railroads and banks pushed for stronger pursuit, private detectives got more involved, and states began coordinating more. The gang's own methods also created risk. Every time they used a contact for horses or shelter, they created a link that investigators could eventually trace. Every new recruit was a potential weak point. So the chase was a long grind. Surveillance, informants, surprise raids, and a lot of waiting for someone to talk. That's the unglamorous side of the outlaw era. Less quick-draw heroics, more patient pressure, and human mistakes. Jesse James lasted as long as he did, not because he was untouchable, but because the system chasing him was still catching up to the kind of criminal mobility he represented. Number 8. Northfield changed everything. By 1876, the James Younger gang was well known, and the pressure was heavy. In September 1876, they attempted to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota, far from their usual base. The idea was likely to strike where people wouldn't expect them, then vanish before a coordinated response could form. Instead, the plan collapsed in the worst possible way for the gang. Townspeople resisted, and the robbery turned into a running fight through the streets and out into the countryside. Several gang members were killed, and the younger brothers were eventually captured after a long chase and injuries. Jesse and Frank escaped, but the original crew was essentially broken. Northfield matters because it exposes the gap between the myth and the reality. The myth says outlaws controlled every situation with cool confidence. The reality is that a small town, when it decides to fight back, can become more dangerous than any organized law force, especially when the outlaws are far from their support network. Northfield also ended the era where the James Younger gang could operate as a large, experienced unit. After that, Jesse's world shrank. He could still find men willing to ride with him, but replacing seasoned partners with new faces brought new problems: less discipline, looser security, and more risk of betrayal. If you want the moment where the legend starts to turn into a countdown, Northfield is it, even though the public didn't fully realize it at the time. Number 9. Hiding in plain sight. After Northfield, Jesse and Frank spent time living under assumed names, including a period in the Nashville, Tennessee area where they tried to look like ordinary citizens. Jesse had married Zerelda Z. Mims, a cousin, and they had children. That family life is often used to soften his image, but it also shows something practical. He wanted stability, and he wanted cover. A man with a wife and kids could blend in more easily than a lone drifter. Still, hiding didn't erase the pressure. The gang's old support network was damaged, and law enforcement attention didn't fade. Jesse rebuilt with new recruits, and that's where paranoia started to show more. In many outlaw stories, the late period is when trust breaks down, and that pattern fits here. New members didn't share the same history of loyalty from the war years, and they also saw the reward money and the fame around Jesse's name. Some robberies in these later years were smaller and sloppier compared to the gang's peak. The more Jesse tried to keep control, the more tense the relationships became. He was still a skilled planner, but he was also living with the constant fear that someone close to him would sell him out. That fear wasn't irrational. Rewards were high, and the authorities had learned that flipping an insider could be more effective than chasing shadows across state lines. By the early 1880s, Jesse James wasn't the leader of an unstoppable band. He was the center of a fragile circle that could snap at any moment. Number 10. Betrayal, death, and the myth that wouldn't quit. Jesse James was killed on April 3, 1882, in St. Joseph, Missouri, shot by Robert Ford, one of his own associates. Ford and his brother Charlie had been tied to Jesse's later crew, and Robert Ford was also connected to the reward pressure surrounding Jesse's capture. The basic fact is simple. Jesse didn't die in a dramatic final shootout against a posse. He died because someone close got a better offer and took it. After Jesse's death, Robert Ford was widely condemned in public opinion, even by people who didn't approve of Jesse's crimes. That reaction shows how strong the legend had already become. People could dislike robbery and still feel that killing the famous outlaw that way was wrong. Frank James later surrendered and faced trials, but he was acquitted and eventually lived quietly, sometimes appearing in public in ways that leaned into the fame. And then the second life of Jesse James really took over, the rumor life. Stories spread that he had survived, that the dead man wasn't really him, and that he lived under another name. Over the decades, various people claimed to be Jesse, and supporters pushed alternative narratives, sometimes fueled by distrust of authorities, sometimes by the simple fact that people enjoy a mystery more than a verified ending. Meanwhile,
Dime novels, newspaper stories, films, and songs kept reshaping him, sometimes as a poor man's hero, sometimes as a symbol of the Wild West, sometimes as a rebel against big business, and sometimes as a straight-up villain. The clearest reality behind all that noise is this. Jesse James was a product of a brutal guerrilla war. He became a skilled criminal in a fractured law system. He benefited from political storytelling and public resentment, and he died when the rewards and fear inside his own circle became stronger than loyalty. The legend kept growing because it was useful. Useful for entertainment, useful for politics, useful for selling a certain idea of the American frontier, even though his actual life happened mostly in the Midwest, not in the classic cowboy landscape people picture when they hear Old West.